In this video, we have a look at some of the more unusual decisions that need to be made on the boundary line in Australian football. So in the first case, we have a set kick from outside the boundary line. But when the ball's kicked, it doesn't actually come back into the field of play. What decision do you need to make as a boundary umpire in this instance? You can pause here before we have a look at the decision. So what happens is the boundary umpire calls out of bounds, and the ball is thrown in at the point where the original kick occurred. What about another situation where the ball's kicked into the field of play, but perhaps a strong wind drags it back out again on the full? So in other words, without touching the ground or without touching any players. Again, pause here before having a look at the decision. So in this case, it's called out of bounds on the full, and the kick for the opposing team is taken where the ball crosses the line after being in the field of play. In this next example, we'll have a look at some of the situations that may occur when the ball bounces close to the boundary line. For clarity, we'll assume that the ball's been kicked and it hasn't been touched by anybody or it hasn't hit the ground prior to what we see in these pictures. In the first case, we can see that the pointy end of the ball has made contact with the ground where the pink star is outside the field of play. But what would occur if the ball then bounced back into the field of play from that particular spot? You can see some vision of that example prior to making your decision. We can see from this picture that the ball has not completely crossed the line. So as a boundary umpire, we let play continue. And even though it's hit the ground on the full, the ball has not completely crossed the line in doing so. Let's have a look at the next example where the point of impact is the same as before, but this time the ball carries on and bounces outside the field of play. What would your decision be, again assuming that the ball has come from a kick and it hasn't been touched or made contact to the ground prior to the vision that we can see here? In this case, this is deemed out of bounds. It's not called out on the full because when the ball hits the ground, it hasn't completely crossed the line. So yes, it is true that it's hit the outside of the field without being touched or without being kicked, but because the ball has not completely crossed the line at that point of impact, it's deemed to be out of bounds. In this example, we have a look at what occurs when there's a set kick from outside the boundary line and what actions the boundary umpire must take in the event that the player plays on. So first of all, we can see in this diagram that the player is kicking from outside the field of play and they're following a red dashed line over their designated mark. But what happens if, in following that red dashed line, they then change direction and use this new direction to bring the ball into the field of play? Or perhaps they start on this new direction and they change again. All of this happening before the ball's been brought back into play. Now, this situation may not occur a lot in boundary lines around the field, but it does occur quite frequently around the goal area. A player may be lined up on a mark through to the centre of the goal, but then what they'll do is they'll change their angle and move in an arc over the boundary line. So what occurs is that if the player changes direction in the process of bringing the ball back into play, the field umpire can call play on. But even if they don't, the boundary umpire needs to be awake to the possibility of changes in direction. So if the player maintains this new line, that's fine, and the ball's allowed to continue into the field of play. If the player changes direction again, prior to the ball being brought into the field of play, the boundary umpire will blow their whistle, and an out of bounds call will be made, where the throw-in takes place adjacent to the point where the player changed direction again. What happens though in the unusual case where the player kicking over the mark maintains the direction of the red dashed line, or perhaps they stop and pause, or they go back on that same red dashed line? Now the field umpire at some point will call play on because they always give players a reasonable time to dispose of the ball, and then they call play on to keep the ball flowing. If that were to occur, as soon as the player changes direction, it would of course be called out of bounds by the boundary umpire, but if they maintain that position, what most likely would occur is a player from the opposing team will come in and tackle the player. If the tackle occurs, the boundary umpire will blow the whistle immediately and call out of bounds. If in evading the tackle the player changes direction, then the boundary umpire will also blow their whistle and call out of bounds. What action should a boundary umpire take if a field umpire has blown their whistle believing the ball to be out of bounds? Pause here before we have a look at the possible outcomes. So in this instance, what the boundary umpire should first of all do is run directly towards the field umpire and advise them that they are 100% certain that the ball is not out of bounds. If that is the case, the ball up will occur inside the field of play, and that would be done by the field umpire. If the boundary umpire is not 100% certain, they also need to advise that to the field umpire. The two will consult and they'll make a decision in accordance to what the outcome is of that discussion. What happens if a similar situation occurs, but this time with a goal umpire, where the boundary umpire and the goal umpire disagree on the outcome? Now, standing at the post, the boundary umpire should be able to talk to the goal umpire and communicate if they believe the decision is theirs or the goal umpire's. You can pause here before we look at the final outcome. After the consultation between the two umpires occurs, if they cannot reach a conclusion, they can call a field umpire in who can assist, or what they will do is they'll make a decision which is the lesser result. Now in this case the lesser result refers to scores. So an out of bounds decision or an out on the full decision is considered to be less than a behind because they result in 0 points, whereas a behind results in 1 point. Let's have a look at a situation that could occur very quickly. A player may take a mark within the field of play, so there's no debating the fact that they've actually marked that, the field umpire's awarded it. But the momentum may carry them over the boundary line, as we can see with this yellow line. They then choose to play on back into the field of play, but they're ahead of their mark. So what would you do as a boundary umpire in this instance? It would be good to pause here and have a think about it before we go through the possible answers. In this situation, the field umpire will be side on to the play. So they're going to be in the best position to adjudicate if a player has moved forward of their mark and decided to play on. So we need to be aware of that. But if a situation occurs where it's been confirmed that the player has played on ahead of the mark and the ball is completely outside the boundary line, then we need to call out of bounds. So in this situation we need to be absolutely certain about three things, and that is that the player has played on, they have played on ahead of their mark, and the ball is completely across the boundary line. Sometimes this will happen very quickly, and if we're not certain of those three things, we should just allow the game to continue on. Let's have a look at some of the things that may occur when a defender is kicking out from their defensive goal line. Now just for clarity, the goal line is the line between the two goal posts, and the behind line is the line between the behind post and the goal post. But for consistency, we'll just call this the defensive goal line for the purpose of this video. So it's unlikely that a defender will stay in the region between or behind the post because they are allowed to go up to a 9-metre line, which is level with the kickoff line at the top of the goal square. But let's have a look at what could occur if the player chooses to kick off from behind the goal line. So in the position shown in the video here where the X is marked, the player is instructed to kick between the posts. Now they could kick straight out, but as long as it's anywhere between those two posts, then that's a legitimate kick from that region behind the goal line. What if the defender fails to do this and disposes of the ball either side of the post but not in between? What decision would you make as a boundary umpire? You can pause here before we have a look at the result. In this instance, we think of where the ball has come from. It's come from the region in between the goal and behind posts, so this will be a decision for the goal umpire. They will tap their chest and indicate that they're ready to make a decision, which will be a behind. So what about a situation where a defender chooses to dispose of the ball behind the boundary line on either side of the behind posts, and they're not using their full distance up to the 9-metre line that we described before? Have a think about what occurs if that player disposes of that ball incorrectly. In other words, hits the behind post or kicks it to the other side of the behind post towards the goal. So in that instance, if the disposal occurs such that it does not go straight over the boundary line, but it goes in the region between the behind and goal posts, or it goes and hits the behind posts, it becomes a boundary umpire decision where they'll blow out of bounds and then throw it in next to the behind post.